Director of the Center for Nonprofits and Philanthropy. We'll get going here in just a second. Angela is working on the last little bits of her prep here as we get her ready and get her queued up for this session. Looking forward to another conversation. One of the things we'll do at the end too is ask you a little bit about what we'd like to do next. And of course, there'll be an opportunity for question and answer, and use the chat box. Feel free to message Nicole or I or Kenny, and we'll kind of be the ones monitoring and tracking some of that for us to make sure that we have those questions available for you. And but good to have you here. Appreciate everybody joining on. Should be a good session. Angela's been working away here all the way up to the last minute, so you can see she's cute. What do you think, Angela?
Can everyone hear me?
There we go.
Good. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for taking some time to come together today and learn a little bit about how we can be strategic as we face this next new stage of fundraising. And today I have to tell you, even though I've done this for over 20 years, I had a really difficult time thinking about how do we talk about something in a different way? Because if you're like me, I've been completely overwhelmed, right? We're overloaded right now with webinars and podcasts and reports and everyone trying to figure out fundraising because we are facing something very new, right? And I thought about bringing a couple of my ACFRE friends, people who have your mentors and have retired. And when I talked with them, they said, we really don't have that much wisdom because we're new at this too. This is such a unique situation. So today I thought about what we can do to think about this differently. And one way is that we really can dig into being strategic. And the thing that, and I guess I'm kind of forcing ourselves to frame our situation differently and to think about it out in a new way outside of what we would do in our traditional development efforts, okay? And our traditional planning. So for me, that means I look to history and strategy to try and figure out situations. So I want to share some of that with you today. Don't worry, we will get to tactics, but I thought we would really be, I guess, benefit from thinking about it from a new perspective instead of just talking about how to do upload a digital solicitation. So I hope that you guys are going to really enjoy this, and we'll certainly have time for questions at the end. Wanted to start with the history piece, and I learned that I loved history when I was doing my doctoral work, and it always is reassuring to me when I'm wondering, what's happening right now in philanthropy or in the world, what can we learn from the past? And I just looked at 4 of the most challenging times in our country's history, or history in general, so some of it's global, but wanted to look and see what sort of similarities, if any, we could find. And the one key thing, and all 4 of these examples I've pulled up, and I have a 5th one in a minute, but philanthropy played a big role in each of these. So if you're looking at in the upper left corner in the War of 1812, isn't it amazing that we're hearing language about quasi-governmental activities? In 1812, sometimes we think that what we're coming up with research and nonprofit management's new, but they were actually trying to come up with government and nonprofit. At that point, we didn't have that term. They're trying to come up with partnerships between service organizations and the government in order to provide services and keep orphanages open, asylums, hospitals. Also, what I thought was interesting is when we look at the first example, that nuns were selling linens. They were manufacturing linens, and it was really more of an entrepreneurial way to address a funding issue. So if we move into World War I, again, we think of the tragedy there, but during that time period, hospitals were built, and it was an incredible growth of the nonprofit sector. Primarily women who were told they weren't allowed to serve in any way. At that time, being a kitchen soldier was great. Good Housekeeping magazine had a little page we could sign that would be a kitchen soldier and not waste food. But what happened during that time period was incredible, because the voluntary action just founded new organizations. And one of the most fun things in some of the research that I did for a paper was realizing that US women were actually what we would call now would be nonprofit leadership or capacity building training. They were helping women from other countries and allied countries figure out how to start similar types of service organizations. But at the same time, hospitals were fully being funded and built overseas. So there was both service and money there. Same thing, if we move to the pandemic, which we might say is a close comparison today, look at some of the things that were happening during that time period. I came across an incredible research paper about this and how it was handled within the US in 4 cities. But volunteers, what were we doing? They were sewing. And seeing that 83,000 masks were made in a couple of weeks. And then there was a volunteer corps that could drive because so many people weren't allowed out. But that was one particular job, was being a volunteer and being out among people to deliver meals and to deliver all these surgical dressings. So not unlike what we talked about today. And I actually saw some great comments from the Surgeon General at that time, and it sounds very similar to what we're dealing with now with distancing, coughing, sneezing. But that was another thing that a nonprofit or a voluntary association did, was they produced pamphlets to help people understand how to stay safe and to distance. So then if we think about the Depression, capital campaigns were completed during that time, right? So we know we're facing a really difficult time, but we know if we compare it economically to the Depression, campaigns were completed, hospitals were built. Again, Cleveland Clinic is a hospital that most of us have heard of. A huge part of that hospital was built during this time period. And even though people were economically very challenged, they often had to just give through either labor or something that they would make. But the common theme through all this is that people are generous and they stepped up to do what they could. And that a lot of gifts didn't necessarily come in a traditional form, but it was voluntary action of people giving what they could, whether it was a small gift or something that they made. So another thing that I found some interesting research that might help us think about more of our sustainable giving is during the Depression, the annual fund gifts that were tracked, they only dipped from 1932 to 1935. And after that, they recovered. So if we look at that in comparison to the Great Recession, again, what we see is it takes about 3 years before we really end up seeing a recovery. So this chart is from our friends at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy and Giving USA. And it's looking at giving trends over the past 40 years. And the yellow bars or gold bars are when we're in recession. So if we look at sort of a stock market crash around the 80s, late 80s, we see 2 years of recession. During that time, giving it's almost flat, but it's still increased a little. When we see 9/11, we have 1 year, but look, the giving's flat during that time. Again, it shows when our country was in a really difficult time, people stepped up with giving. And those of you that actually do follow the research with Giving USA, you know that 80% of giving comes from individuals, and primarily from people who are making small gifts and giving outside of what we consider mega donor range. Now, looking at the Great Recession, once we hit in 2008, you see that we do have 2 years of decline right here, and it takes us 2 years to recover. So from this, I mean, no one really knows where we're going or what's happening with this scenario, but from this, we can say that this is something our development shop should probably be preparing for 3 to 4 years until we get back to normal. Hopefully it won't be that long, but that would be a conservative way to try and think about what do we need to do to prepare ourselves. And hopefully, outside of that time frame, hopefully this gives us a little encouragement to know that during very difficult times, giving doesn't stop. Okay, so how we can prepare for this is to be strategic in what we do with fundraising. And if we stop and think about what is happening in the world, what is happening within our organization. It's going to give us a really firm foundation from which to start developing our fundraising program and plans. So you probably have more inputs than this, but in the funnel that I created here, I started thinking about, what's going on in our community. If you pause with your leadership at your team or your development staff, how is your organization specifically impacted? What's going on in your local economy? Obviously, it's going to be different in different places. We have to think about now, this is a global pandemic. This isn't a flood. This isn't a hurricane that we know came through and now the rest of the world can give to us. Or support us in some way. Instead, we're all in this together. So we have to really think about a global response. What are our local and federal government able to do and help help us continue providing services? And the other thing is we need to look as development officers, what's happening in our profession. And as I mentioned, there are a lot of resources out there because fundraisers are trying to figure this out. And, primarily we're used to disaster fundraising. We're not used to something that's so long-term, that's also impacted the economy dramatically. And depending on where you are, for those of you who are in Texas, and we know we have quite a few of those folks on the call today, we also are dealing with the oil industry crash. So we really have three elements in play here. So even though we're at a stage where we know our organizations need money, our advice is that if we take time to be thoughtful and strategic, we're actually going to be able to build a much stronger development plan and help our organizations raise more money. So ideally, our goal is to get you from where you are, which is the assessment I just discussed on the left, over to where you want to be as an organization with your fundraising. And a way to do that is to make sure that what we do is very intentional and where it's based in data as much as possible and just not on the most recent fundraising trends. You want to stay true to your organization and remember that everything that we do should really align with the best practices in our industry. And we're going to create new best practices as we go along. In this assessment process, I mentioned you're going to think about your organization and how it fits into the external environment. So we really want to have an honest assessment about what your organization is able to provide, where it fits in, whether it's a first response organization or if it might be later down the road. The other thing is you want to make sure that you're really transparent with all of your constituents, but particularly starting with the board and internal leadership about where you are financially. And here I've given an illustration of the three different things we're dealing with in Houston. We can't just think about the virus. We can't just think about the economy. We also have one of our largest industries that's struggling, that's at an additional stressor. So we have to think about how can our organization adapt to the shocks that your community and organization is feeling. The main thing to remember in all of this is that if it seems dire to kind of figure out where we are, remember that's just a snapshot of where we begin. If your organization was important and your mission was important a few months ago, it still is. And so we're going to think of ways that we can be thoughtful on how to continue marketing that mission and explaining to people the value of your organization. And one of the first things that I think we can do is to create a fundraising plan. Hopefully most of you have those. Some of you don't. If not, it's time to develop one. And the reason I say is develop a written plan is because that can be a tool for you to help educate your leadership who may be a little nervous about fundraising right now. You want to be able to link the actions that your development team is taking now, whether that's a team of 1 or a team of 100. You want to be able to link those actions to the revenue that's coming in and be able to demonstrate what your team is doing for the organization. Because sadly, I've seen way too many organizations think that cutting fundraisers is a good option right now. And the problem is that with that is you don't have anyone continuing to fill the pipeline. And philanthropy is going to help us through this time period in the next 2 years. But if you don't have the development staff, who's building those relationships, who's cultivating donors, who's helping them understand what your current needs are and being creative with ways that they can give now. So if you can create a plan that develop some really concrete goals around, okay, yes, we're not going to be doing major gifts fundraising for the next 3 months. But what we will do is cultivate all of our donors and talk to more donors than we ever have before. We're going to make a goal of retaining our donors. And you can also build in scenario planning. For example, if you had an event plan that had to be canceled, what you'll do is adjust those revenue projections that you may have for the rest of the year. But essentially, this is a tool that's going to help you mitigate your risk and to help build confidence among your senior leadership and board that, yes, fundraising is a really critical function that we need to keep doing right now. Okay. It also is probably going to bring up an opportunity for you to reevaluate and reimagine the different fundraising streams in your organization too. For organizations that are very event heavy, this is a chance for you to look and say, wow, we realized these 3 events had to be canceled, we're in trouble. So maybe we should start shifting our portfolio where we have more traditional fundraising through annual fund or major gifts, and try and initiate a special gifts program. So I'm trying to think about the strategic steps that can illustrate what we do for the organization. And if we look at what's happening today, if senior leadership still wants to know, they're like, people aren't giving, so we don't need our fundraising staff. Well, absolutely we do. Organizations are raising money. We're seeing great news about that. I don't know if anyone else has seen Giving Tuesday Now results. That happened on May 5th. As of this morning, I hadn't seen the results come out for that. But we'll see what interesting trends and how that compares to our traditional giving in Giving Tuesday. We can see if an emergency giving shows any sort of interesting spikes. But we do know that people want to give now, and they are asking how they can give. So it's up to us to be able to actually provide them with an opportunity. We know that we are having success moving fundraising events online. We have an example of a nonprofit in Houston that actually exceeded goal and raised $560,000. Their goal was only $500,000, so they actually made more money than they anticipated in their traditional gala. We know that videos and text solicitations are becoming, they're producing results. 97% of texts are being opened compared to about 21% on emails being opened. So it's a time for us to think creatively about digital fundraising and how we communicate. And even if you're not soliciting, perhaps sending your message and story through text to reach out. We know corporations and foundations are certainly trying to help out, but we also know that a lot of large private foundations are trying to wait and sort of be a third wave of fundraising at this time. So we say definitely we need to have people talking with our funders, the traditional foundations who support us. We need to let them know what our organization needs are, but understand that they're trying to figure out the best way that they can support the community and have the largest impact. So those gifts may come in more toward 3rd or 4th quarter. And this was one of the most exciting things that I found in prepping for this today in our conversation, is that people are finally opening up their donor advised funds. Often those are criticized as a vehicle that people are using as a savings account, and they're building up funds, but it's actually not coming into, the donations aren't actually hitting the nonprofit market. So as of May 5th, Fidelity released some really interesting news that 18% increase in giving from their donor advised fund clients just since January this year. And that over $230 million has been directed since January to the COVID-19 crisis. So it's good to know that those vehicles are being tapped into. So I think, some of that can be supporting evidence as well to your leadership that we need to be strategic and our organization needs to keep fundraising. We have some general tips in the fact that we need to over communicate with our donors. And that doesn't mean that we're just going to send them information. What that means is we're going to try and talk to more donors than we ever have. And we won't necessarily be asking for money right now, but instead what we're going to do is reach out to them and ask how they're doing. It's always okay to reach out and talk to your donors, right? So you want to find out what's going on in their world, if your organization can support them. But this is when the primary piece of development comes in, is that you have to listen. And we say that's one of the most critical skills in fundraising, is listening to them, taking your donors' advice. The other things you want to make sure in those conversations, you can inform them of what's going on in your organization. Say, things are changing on a daily basis, but this is what we're doing to adapt, and we promise we'll keep you apprised. And what we found from some veteran fundraisers is that during difficult times in the past, anywhere between 10 to 30% is the estimate of donors who are then going to say at the end of the conversation, so how can I help you? And they're going to ask. It's going to be a natural way to raise money, as opposed to sort of a cold call where you set out to ask somebody to give $100. Instead, find out about them, talk to them about your organization, and then see how to make that connection on how they might want to help out. When you're looking at a large donor prospect database, the way to start is to look at your major donors, sure, but instead of just focusing on the high-end donors, don't forget to talk to your most loyal donors, the people who've given 3 years or 5 years in a row to your organization, because they're the ones who have demonstrated commitment and are going to be willing to make that the sort of emergency gift at this point. The other thing we want is for you to frame the needs of your organization in a new case statement. So we're going to talk about that in just a minute in some more detail. You want to also take advantage of technology and social media to share the good things that are happening currently in your organization and this new reason that you need support. Okay, so it's a way to tell your new story. And of course, we're going to be sensitive to our donors' needs throughout this entire time, but they have to understand where we are as an organization in order to even know what they can do to help. And I don't know about you guys, but again, I've talked with a lot of people who say, I want to help, but I'm not sure how yet. And it's our job as fundraisers to be able to help them figure that out, right? And to provide opportunities for our volunteers and donors to still be engaged with us. So when you're thinking about pivoting this case for support, we want to do a couple things. One, we don't want to talk about, 5 years down the road and endowing new scholarships and buildings necessarily. We're talking about what's happening right now. Our development plans are shorter. Our sense of urgency is, let's help our nonprofits stay open for the next 6 months, the next 12 months. So only talk about what you need. And the other, probably the most important piece of this is to remember how we frame that need, because people aren't inspired to give because your organization has needs, right? If anything, this may lead to some really interesting and challenging conversations about, why don't you have 6 months reserves? Why are you in this situation? And you have to be able to have some talking points and be transparent about your financial situation if you don't indeed have 6 months reserves. You could say that's something we're working toward, but we know this is going to be a long recovery and we hope that you'll help us. That's why we're looking to our most loyal donors. Instead, what you want to do is position your need as what your clients need and who you're serving. So remember that how important that persuasive element is when you're thinking about telling your story for now in your organization. Really focus on how the donor's gift is going to impact other people. Okay, and I give an example at the bottom of this slide for you. It's more persuasive to say, please give now so we can continue to provide after-school programs when we're all back in person. We miss our kids so badly. We hope you're well. That's a lot easier for a donor to hear and be inspired by than to say, well, if you don't give, we're going to have to lay off half of our staff. Right? So it's not about the organization. It's about the difference we're all trying to make in the world. And when we start talking with donors, we want to look at particular groups. We want to involve our board members. That is a key constituent. You don't want to wait until the end to figure that out, but instead you want to start right away with your board and allow them to help you figure out some of the steps forward, particularly since we're talking about a thoughtful strategic plan for fundraising. You need to have their buy-in. You're going to talk with your consistent funders, as I mentioned, and also those most loyal donors, and build that sense of community among them and the strength among those constituent groups as you move forward together. Now, we are going to get to tactics, and some of these are new and how we can be strategic, or at least different than how we function in normal development and fundraising times. One, I mentioned, now's a time to experiment with electronic giving. As I mentioned, text, online events, using technology to try and do stewardship. That's another example that I've seen. Some folks that have had to cancel alumni events or reunions instead, or rather than canceling, are just moving them online. Try to involve your volunteers and bring them online. Is there a way that they can actually provide service through Zoom or something to your clients? So be really creative about how you're using electronic giving. And that includes, of course, just video solicitations and what you think is a more direct ask. And now's the time that you can also invest in your staff and reinvent what you do in the development office and what you consider as work. And we're going to dig into that in a little bit later. And another thing is, now is a time to invest in your infrastructure. So I don't know if we tend to think about marketing in this way, but when we have a lull, as we do now, where we really can't be doing major gift asks, what can we be doing to prepare for this? And some of the marketing consultants that I know, and some of the researchers that I've talked with about it, are saying this is the perfect time to really mine your database. This is the perfect time to upgrade your database, to clean it, to make sure you know, to do that data hygiene, make sure that you have proper contact information for everyone. That's a good reason to call somebody you may not have heard from in a while. We're wanting to make sure we have all of your information correct. And how are things going for you? That's one way to reach out to folks that maybe are lapsed donors. Another thing that you can do within this is to invest in your prospect research. It's not time to say that prospect research is an area to save money, but instead what we want to do is mine our loyal donors to see who we know has an interest and capacity to give that maybe we haven't uncovered or discovered yet. And the other thing is, within managing our staff, is we have to learn how we're going to do fundraising remotely and how we're going to manage our teams, right? One thing that may come out of this is we may not see as many regional gift officers or traveling, gift officer positions, because we'll realize that these types of calls during this, next maybe 12 months of us doing virtual donor cultivation, we might find this to be as a satisfactory method for some of what we thought we had to do in person. If we save the expenses of travel, how could we then maybe reinvest that? Could you have a more robust social media presence? Could you develop online giving that you haven't before? So these are just some of the opportunities that sort of reinventing how we do fundraising remotely could be helpful and change how we work in the future. But right now, I think some of the things that we can look to figure out how to manage our teams remotely are those regional development offices, if you happen to be part of a larger organization. What did we do to make our regional officer who's in another state feel like part of our team? Well, we made sure that they had access to the same tools that our development office does. As far as if they're in the office, they have access to the database and our shared drive. We would make sure and bring them in weekly for our team meetings. They could call in. I want to make sure also that you have a little time for them to be able to connect with our team that's in the office together every day. So one of the things that I've seen promoted as most effective is to make sure and build some of that sort of water cooler time into the calls that we have. If we're doing a staff meeting now, make sure and give 10 minutes at the beginning just to check in with everyone. Let them sort of be comfortable in their own space and share what's going on in their life, and that really can help us remember to be empathetic as we work with one another and be a little more patient if we need to. But it builds that social connection as best as we can when we actually aren't in place together. The other thing that we do to manage our fundraisers if they're not in the office every day is we look at our our dashboards and we check our metrics. That's the reason we have this and those tools in order to help us keep moving forward. So now it's important to use those, but you also want to make sure that what we're measuring is the kind of behavior we want to see right now. If you have a principal gifts officer who is not in fact asking for those $5 million gifts, how are you going to measure that individual? Instead, if your strategic goals in your development plan are to talk with donors, if they're cultivation steps, make sure that you adjust the metrics to the actual work that your team is doing and the work you want your team to accomplish. And then, of course, we want to take time to mentor our staff as best as we can. Maybe have some senior members of our fundraising team or leadership talk to newer members or even volunteers who are interested in helping you with development. Now's a really great time to train them. So if we think about how we're looking at fundraising from a distance at this point, I've already mentioned we've got to leverage technology. Think of new ways that you can communicate the mission of your organization, and that might be using videos or podcasts to talk with donors. One of the things that I found to be useful is to actually do something like this, where we're sharing a screen when you're talking with some of your major donors. If you happen to be in the middle of a campaign, if you've happened to really have some great impact stories, go ahead and put together a slide deck or video and take time with your top donors. You won't necessarily do this with everyone, but as you sit down and think about how you're reaching out to donors, you'll have a specific cultivation plan for them, like we always do. So for those donors that you think are close to being asked, they're in a major gift pipeline, take time to actually share images with them and give them time to ask questions and talk about how we can get the organization, really to that next step in our campaign goal. The other thing to think about within a distance perspective is how do we reach our mass prospect base? And this is when we might look and turn to a peer-to-peer fundraising platform. That can be very successful with some organizations, and there are a lot of really whole new industries cropped up over the last decade around days of giving and peer-to-peer giving. So you may want to look at that for the first time if you haven't. And then I've mentioned the opportunity to try and use text, because we know that right now that is an effective way to reach people. And I've just given an example of Engage by Cell. I've worked with them in the past, and they've just really helped educate me on the different ways that we can use that technology outside of just a cold, message text to give. There are a lot of creative things you can do, so that's one opportunity that you may want to look into. And finally, as a question that I've had around tactics and have been getting recently, is how are we going to recover from all these canceled events that we have? So one, I would encourage you to think about your events and look at them to see which ones you can reschedule, which ones that you can instead ask your donors if you can, to let them know that you have to cancel the event, but would you be willing to allow us to keep your donation? And then the third thing that you can do is make it a virtual event. So we have some examples of that being very successful as well. But this is a really good time for us to strategically think about our revenue streams and to reduce our reliance on events. Because again, it's something that we can't control, and we certainly aren't going to be able to control it in the next 12 months. So as you're developing your plan to share with your team and your senior leadership, I encourage you to look at this from a 3 to 6 month time frame. We talk and typically encourage you to have an annual development plan, and this is what we're going to do from July 1 to June 30. But now we know we have to be more flexible. We know there are a lot of things that we still don't know. And so if we can try and break that down into more manageable chunks of 3 months, 6 months, that's going to allow us to be more flexible and know when we can indeed have an event, or when we can look to these other types of opportunities, whether it's in person or digitally, to reach out and cultivate our donors. So I tried to talk with some fundraisers that have been at this even a lot longer than I have, and did some research and wanted to share some of the lessons that they had. One is the person who gave me the idea about focusing on the development plan quarterly so you can be flexible. Also, we have to continue our campaigns. They said, don't stop fundraising, which is what we hear in all of our fundraising seminars right now. But what you have to do is be a little more creative and understand that the cultivation time is probably going to be extended. Your campaign's probably going to be extended, but you can do things that will allow you to continue booking pledges and doing increasing your fundraising. One is you can be a little more creative in how you craft pledge agreements or gift agreements. Maybe extend over a 3-year time period. I saw some advice about if it's a stock gift, you could make a conditional gift that, I'll give this once the price hits a certain amount. So there are a lot of different creative things that we can do within our pledges in order to keep campaigns moving forward. Okay. The other thing is to think about the different tax benefits that we have. Now that we know that we have the above line $300 deduction for people who normally wouldn't give, that's an incentive. We know that, and certainly throughout history, we've seen this as well. People aren't necessarily motivated for tax purposes and by tax purposes, but what it does now when we have these changes in tax laws, it influences the timing of our gifts and how we give. So we know when the last changes in our latest tax laws came out, we saw a decrease, and there were donors that started bundling their gifts where they would say, we'll give to you and what this year, but we're going to start skipping and we're going to give every other year in order for us to be able to take a tax deduction. That's a new behavior that was shaped and came out of the taxes. So make sure that you have either advisors or somebody on your development staff that can help donors think through that, and because we want to make giving easy and make sure that it makes sense for our donors. The other thing that I've talked about a lot so far is to make sure you're talking with more donors than you ever have. And that's checking in with people and letting them know that, yes, your organization still matters, you're still serving people, and you want to make sure that they're engaged with you. But it's, if you look at different ways that you can approach that tactically, maybe you try and reach out to 5 or 10 donors a day. How do you fill the rest of your day? If you have a smaller database, or if you have a big team, you're still going to be able to get through that donor base pretty quickly. So this is when you start investing in the internal systems. Are there ways you can improve your gift processing? Your gift entry? What about your reporting? This is a really good time to develop all the reports we wish we had, but we don't know how to set those up. Take time to develop that and automate our dashboards and the analytics for the department. So you can go in and make the most use of our fundraising software. There are a lot of development offices out there that are only using their fundraising software at about 50% of its capacity. So this is a really good time to make your office more efficient. And isn't that a great thing to share with donors as to what you're doing with your time? And the other thing that we can do as development officers, because a lot of the time other members of our organizations don't understand what we do. And so now is a great time to make sure you build that relationship with your CFO and your finance office. You should be partnering together and be, very honest and transparent about your financial situation, but also so you can be on the same page and know exactly how much money you need to raise. And hopefully through this time period, you'll also be able to help the finance team understand that, the value that we do bring as a development department, and that we're not just an expense for the organization. On the program side, one thing is to be willing to do whatever we have to support the programs. So I've heard and read some stories that have just been really inspiring. Development officers at hospitals that have been instead spending time calling to try and procure PPE equipment. They didn't think this is what they would do, but instead this is a role that when they can't be out visiting with donors, this is a really vital function to help their program continue operating. So don't think of isolating ourselves, which we can become siloed a little bit. Make sure this is a time we dig even deeper into the programs and help support our program staff. So as I was going through this process of how can we try and look at where we are and move forward in a really thoughtful, strategic way. So I looked to the top 4 fundraising textbooks that we use to teach this, and decided to just look at the topics. And what I found was it was really easy to start separating these into 3 different areas that we can focus on as development managers. We're going to look at the external piece of what we do, and that's our case statement, how we fit into the external world, understanding that campaigns are about community building and awareness building and advocacy. And also, what I chose to put stewardship in here and gratitude, because that's really much more externally focused. We know that organizations that invest in stewardship, which again is a great thing to be doing right now, is be very intentional about thanking your donors. We know that they have better retention rates, and that people are much more willing to increase in giving. A second way to analyze this is to think about our people, and remember that everything we do is based in relationships. So think about how can you be strategic with your donors, but also with your staff, a lot of what we've talked about. And then we move into the tactical piece, where it really is looking at managing our function. How do we get better at making the ask? What are various types of vehicles that we can use, and different types of solicitations that we can employ? And I chose to put ethics under a tactical piece, because I think it's such a critical element of what we do in running our development shops, that I think we should think of that as in a day-to-day process, and how we bring that into the culture of our organization. So I leave you with these 10 steps going forward. I won't read through it because we want to get to your questions, but we want to definitely be intentional. We want to continue our fundraising and help those around us know how vital it is, and how vital it's going to be once we can start asking more regularly, and when we get back to what our new normal is. We want to definitely have a plan that is based in this new case statement and gives people a reason to support us. And we're going to really take time to reimagine how we can do development more efficiently and differently. And within this whole piece, we're going to remember to take care of our people, whether it's our team or our volunteers. We can't forget them, because volunteers become donors. And then, of course, our donors, we want to reach out to them. So when we think about strategy, I think a piece of it that we always have to infuse is the enthusiasm and belief in what we do. Fundraising isn't just an expense for an organization. It is a very noble work, but it's really critical work, particularly when times are difficult. And I hope that you can be inspired and take this back to your development teams. But all those incredible stories that I started with at the beginning of our presentation, and during the wars and the Depression, if you dig into that, we find incredible stories of generosity. And the really neat thing about now, if we can frame our situation a little differently, is to think about the fact our stories are unfolding every day. And if you can try and focus on that and look to those stories within your organization to share, that's going to inspire other people to give. And it's one of the neatest things about being a nonprofit professional right now, is because as fundraisers, we get to help be a part of creating these great stories that people are going to be reading about 50 years from now. So I hope that leaves you with a little inspiration for what we're doing, and I'm certainly happy to answer any questions that you have. And we're going to provide the slide deck for us, and actually the webinar, I believe, is recorded and we posted online too.
Yep, that's true, Angela. We'll be putting all this stuff online and making it available. It took us a little while to get some of the other ones up, but most of those are up, and this one will be up in a couple of days. And the slides themselves get up pretty quick as well. Some questions are coming in, so Kenny and I think are going to bounce back and forth here to try and feed some of these to you. I don't know, Kenny, did you want to get started on?
Yeah, that would help. Thanks so much.
You bet.
Yeah, sure. We've got a few that have floated in. I'll start out with one question that came in this environment, are there approaches that we should consider in relation to planned giving prospects in terms of how we approach planned giving prospects in a time period like now? Maybe comment on that for us.
Absolutely. And the Planned Giving Council of Houston is going to do an online webinar about that. And I think it's coming up in the next couple of weeks. So that could be an additional resource for you. What I'm understanding about this is that this can go in either two ways. One is that people want to give and now and they want to help. So they're willing to make that commitment to a legacy gift. The other alternative with planned giving is that they're a little more fearful and they aren't willing to make the commitment because they want to protect their family. So I'm not a planned giving expert, but I do know that those are the two things that people are talking about in that area. And I would encourage you to try and look to a local planned giving council to get some really good detailed advice about that.
Okay, and then another good one, Will, we just had this conversation, so maybe you'd have something to add as well, but one question that came in is, what are the changing parameters in which foundations are receiving and evaluating proposals in this environment?
Well, I can start and then maybe Will can chime in, but we know that foundations have really become they've loosened some of their restrictions. They're allowing donors to use money in different ways. That many of them have posting emergency like LOIs or creating emergency funds that allows the process to be streamlined in order to make application. And I'm trying to think, as we've talked with funders, one theme that keeps coming out is they're sort of waiting to figure out their strategy and what they can do to help. So they're waiting for like these emergency government loans to come in and take care of funding for the next few months. And then the funders are wanting to hear from their grantees to understand what they need, and they're doing environmental scans to try and figure out how they can have the greatest impact with their giving in the community. Will, do you have?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you touched on some of the key things. I mean, each one is a little different. I mean, we were just talking with some funders locally, some of which are modifying a little, but not really a whole lot. So you touched on it. I mean, there is some variability. So part of it has to do with who are we talking to? So a health-based funder is going to be potentially more likely to want to prioritize or push money out. We were talking with Wynn Rosser at the Temple Foundation, right? And he's adjusted some of his elements and thinking about how they're going to reorient themselves. And then I was talking with another, and they're like, our strategic priorities are good. They make sense to us. They still make sense in this environment, and we're going to continue to try and move forward. So I've heard both.
One other thing I'd add from our most recent roundtable with funders is there seemed to be consistency around they're intentionally trying to find ways to have more universal type applications. So it's so important for them to get money out that they're collectively in their individual communities looking for ways to make it easier for applications to come in so that it doesn't seem redundant to nonprofits that just need money. So you can anticipate that in your respective communities, local foundations and donors are intentionally looking at ways to make the application process easier because they seem to have shifted to wanting to push money out without the restrictions maybe that have been there in the past. One other question is, Angela, you mentioned making decisions on data. And one of the questions is, or has to do with, there's lots of national data out there. Where would you recommend that local nonprofits look for data in their individual communities?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because that's one of the things that I know that the center has just done a local study of the Brazos Valley, and one of the key concerns was trying to understand what's happening locally and being able to share real-time information with funders about their own organization and figuring that out. So I would look to potentially community foundations. If you're in, depending where you are, I think that they're doing some good surveys. They're in Houston, I know they're doing Understanding Houston is a new way that they're trying to measure giving and philanthropic activity at the community foundation. Perhaps some United Ways would have surveys, certainly looking at local centers. Some of the national information, I think, is really taking a while to come in. Will, would you have some ideas about the national level?
I have yet to see stuff. I mean, there's a conversation about what we're doing in Texas. We're just talking, we've got that queued up to be involved in that next week. I have yet to see much in the way of the national conversation.
Yeah, me either. So that's why I was struggling a little bit with that. But I think locally that there are people trying to figure out what's going on. And we know that there are a lot of different organizations in Texas are doing that. And hopefully we can try and consolidate some of that information and dig through it and take the 2 or 3 key points and share it with people.
Yeah, that's all I'm seeing is regional information coming out from particular spots who've sent out pretty quick surveys similar to what we did here.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that makes sense.
Angela,
oh, go on ahead, Kenny.
Oh, sorry. This was a quick one. Can you recommend 2, 3, 4 fundraising textbooks or reads that folks consider taking in?
Absolutely.
To our bookshelf.
Here are 2 of them. No. So the Complete Guide to Fundraising Management, and maybe we can get these either in text or put it up on our resource page afterward. But this is by Stanley Weinstein, and this is in multiple editions, but it's an ACFR and CFRE. So it's written from a practical perspective, and it's not real theoretical. Then this, Achieving Fundraising Excellence, this is now in its 4th edition. And this is by our friends at the Lilly Family School. A lot of the folks that were working there when I was in my doctoral program and have now retired. But it's an edited book, so you're actually getting information from scholars all around the country. So those are a couple of them. Another I looked at was Capital Campaign Management, and then Fundraising Management. And that actually is by Adrian Sargent. So I don't use that book commonly, but for this case, I thought it was interesting to see the topics in it. But we'll definitely get those posted for you on the resources.
Mm-hmm.
We got just a couple of minutes left, Angela. But there was one question about, and you talked a little bit about having to pivot and sort of reorient ourselves. And so there was a very specific question about an individual has had a hard time engaging individual givers. An organization has had a hard time engaging individual givers. They primarily emphasize a lot on corporations. Just some thoughts about how an organization might have to change. You also gave the example, this might be a time to not rely on events, but need to try something different. So maybe just some thoughts around shifting your strategies in a time like this and what that might entail.
Right. Well, we do know now is not the most ideal situation to try and focus on donor acquisition, right? And if you talk about shifting your strategies, then that's going to be some investment in donor acquisition in a sense. What I would encourage you to do is to start with relationships that you have with either external funders as corporations or major donors. That I guess if you start with the existing relationships and ask for their help, one message that we're trying to send is it's always a good time to ask for help, right? And to update your donors. If you can engage them and say, we've never really done corporate fundraising before, but we know that you've been really involved in this throughout your career. Do you have some advice for us? It's amazing how many volunteers might step up to help with that kind of a situation. If you haven't done major and special gifts programs before, if you've really relied on events and annual fund, now's the time to go to your board members, the most loyal volunteers and donors you have, to test the waters with them and say, this is what we're looking to do. Understanding though that a major gifts program typically is going to take 3 to 5 years until it's mature. So that's kind of a hard way to shift right now. But if you start with the people who are closest to you, I think you can make that change. And the other thing is, this is when your finance team can come in and really help you with financial scenario planning, and to try and say, okay, if we're going to drop an event, then how can we possibly make that money up, either through annual fund or major gifts? Or if you want to do something that's a little more of a social entrepreneurial side of, wanting to sell merchandise, I think you really need to rely on your finance team to help you with that planning. Is that helpful?
Yeah, that's good. I just wanted to hear some thoughts. I mean, I know I want to be sensitive to folks' time, but before you head out here, we wanted to ask you what you'd like to see next. So if we could, I'm going to give this poll I'm going to try and launch this. It's a real simple question about sort of what topics you'd like to see. Let's see if this works. And folks see that. Now viewing the questions. All right, so you can go on ahead and click on those and see what looks interesting to you, and see what comes up. There they go. Cool. So you can click on as many as you like as far as what comes up there.
Why am I not surprised that our conversations with donors has a real interest from this particular group, right? When people are worried about fundraising, we're worried about getting to our donors and learning what they need. That's one of the biggest challenges in this whole piece, is how do we strategically work with donors and help them fulfill, really their desires for their giving,
And then something around planning, right? That's helpful. So we're going to sort of look at some of our resources that we have here with some of the other faculty and some of the strategic relationships we have, and being able to pull that in and offer probably a couple more of these. It'll probably be a couple weeks before we get to the next one, but this helps. I love this idea of a conversation with donors and having a few that would just join us on a conversation and think a little bit about the way they're thinking about giving. Yeah, we'll talk about that in the staff and try and figure out what that would look like, but that would be a nice one to be able to do. Thanks, everybody. I know you had some more questions. You were asking for a couple of things. Angela's textbooks will get posted online, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks, probably this time, and appreciate all of you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.